This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Well, welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We are back here in the studio. As you know, for the last few weeks, we've been doing a combination of solo shows where I've been talking about the elements of innovation programs, kind of also updating some of the content that, quite honestly, we shared on this show probably a decade ago, back in the early days. But we've also been bringing on guests and experts. And what's important for me is not just to bring in people who have the theory, but it's also about people who've actually done it, to give you good practical advice, but also to give you the unvarnished truth about what does it really take to take your ideas and turn them into reality. And today is no different for that. We're bringing on an expert who's been around for many, many years, seen it all, and it's quite funny. We were talking before the show about the fact that we haven't really met prior to this, but when we start talking about who you know and experiences, it tends to cross those paths. So let me bring on our guest today, Jeff Degraff. Jeff, thanks for joining us here today at Killer Innovations.
Phil, thanks for having me on.
Now, Jeff, you are, how do you describe yourself? Now, you are a professor at University of Michigan. You're wearing your Michigan regalia there, right? Okay, I'm a University of Illinois guy here. Got to be a little, a little careful, It'd be worse if you said you were Notre Dame. Then we'd really have a problem.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think I'm the end of a whole line of what professors used to be. I used to call them pragmatics. So in the old days, you were expected to not only write and have a theory and have an NSF grant, you were also expected to be in companies. And so when I was brought to Michigan, I was brought there by Robert Quinn, who, if you know anything about organizational development, C.K. Prahalad, the most famous innovation strategist of the 20th century for sure. So I was around people who did that. It's a little different now. I just leave it at that.
But what's your background? I mean, we talked before the start of the show about some overlap that we had at back in the early days of Silicon Valley. But how did you go straight through to get your PhD, or did you?
Yeah, I'm the archetypal. I'm from the Midwest. I came to college as a teamster and a wrestler. That's how I got into college. I was a terrible student, and when I got to college, it just was like a fish in water because I don't do well with a lot of rules. I never did. I'm not a very structured person that way, but I'm really a motivated person, and I'm very unorthodox. So what happened was when I was at Michigan doing my master's degree, I came to study with a guy named Rudolf Arnheim. To your listeners, if you know anything about the history of creativity, it starts at the University of Berlin in 1900 with a man named Max Wertheimer. Yep. He has two prize students, Kurt Lewin, who creates organizational psychology, and Rudolf Arnheim. So if you're a design thinker, this is the guy. I'm his last graduate student. And while I'm trying to form my committee, he has a stroke and he can't be on my committee. So I transferred to the University of Wisconsin. And what happened there was amazing. I worked for a center there that had gotten one of the first 3 supercomputers in the country. So I got to work on what are called cognitive inquiry strategies, how to make this big pile of bolts think. So I'm 25 when I graduate. I'm a boy. I'm an advisor on what's called applied integrated systems to Apple and Steve Jobs as he's been pushed out. And I took a job that stunned everybody. I had a job offer at an Ivy League school. And I met a guy, you can't make this stuff up. I met a guy in a hippie bar who worked for a guy who had a $20 million pizza company. And he said, we're doing really cool stuff. And I must have had beers with him like 6 or 7 times. And I finally just said, you know what? This is what I want to do. So what I did was I signed up to this $20 million pizza company, became that's where I got the title, the Dean of Innovation, built all kinds of stuff. We get into that if you want to. But 5 years later and $5 billion later, I sold the company to Mitt Romney. It was Dominoes Pizza, right? So, it was one of those crazy things you do when you're young. And I learned about business by building one. And then after that, what was interesting is when they brought me to Michigan, I remember telling Bob Quinn, I don't want to teach MBAs. They're dull, drab, and awful. You can hear them think, right? And he laughed and said, "That's why we want you here." Now, you got to remember, Phil, back in the day, there was only Mike Ray at Stanford, and I'm he's much older than I am, and I was a boy, and everybody looked askance. And then what happened was interesting. Then the whole world turns in the 90s. You start getting kids, the Larry Pages and all those kids come out of your programs, right? And all of a sudden, you're not crazy. But I will say the first 5 or 6 years that I was there, people thought I had, three heads. And so I guess even a stop clock is right twice a day. I'm more of a Forrest Gump character than I am any sort of grand plan.
Talk about the almost the version of the accidental professor. you stumble
Absolutely.
you stumble into wherever you end up.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I've always had a portfolio life. Very early on, I built the Innovatrium labs. People forget this. Before we worked, in fact, some of those people came out and looked at our labs, how we did it. What sometimes called creativity clusters, right? Where you're doing the work that the organization can't by cross boundary. And Michigan is people don't know this. It's the second largest research university in the planet behind
Yep.
Hopkins, right? It's a very large research place. So the notion is you've got to get those people together in places where somebody's not trying to pick your pocket or there's not some argument over tenure. And so with the Hayworth Company, I threw in, X amount and they threw in X amount. We acquired the bank across the street, tore the front off of it, and gave keys to the 7 coolest professors we knew, said, "We're not interested in you old guys. Bring your kids, bring your PhDs, bring your smart kids." And that's where, Eco-Imagination and Hulu and all Coke Zero, all that stuff that gets associated with these things. A lot of that came out of there. It's not, I didn't do it. I don't want your readers, your listeners to think I did it, but I just created the treehouse and knew a few people, made a few calls and said, do you want to play?
Well, and it's interesting. And I don't know if you have the same experience, right? Because I was working with Phil Phillips at the University of Illinois on tech transfer. U of I ranks in the top 10 of federal research dollars, but it ranked 291st with commercialization of any IP that came out of the university. So we could generate a lot. We get a lot of funding. Don't do anything with it. Don't produce.
But
anything.
that's the challenge. The challenge in tech transfer. They're always patting themselves on the back.
Right.
The challenge of tech transfer is innovation as a pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, you're unlocking the secrets of nature. There's a lot of grinding it out. A lot of people never get any glory. And and I know the biggest innovations are things like material science and what can this material do? And then at the very end of that, the top of the pyramid, you get the whole idea of what a startup does. You build an application. But tech transfer is the hardest part because innovation is highly situationally specific. How you make an F-35 is completely different than how you set up a fine dining restaurant. There's nothing in common. And the problem is most of these people are generalist. And innovation, you have to get very close to the domain experts to figure out what's really worthwhile, what's going on here, what's going to run and what's not going to run. That was one of the secrets when we started building these innovation indexes. One of the real keys is it's time-based. It's only an innovation for a minute, and it's very situational.
Right.
So it doesn't surprise me at all. But, I think you're being unfair to Illinois. A lot of that stuff doesn't get built, but a lot of the core science that goes into modern stuff and places like Iowa State, who knew, right? They have a huge impact, but they're not glorified places. Purdue is another one, very underrated.
Right. Well, but that is interesting, right? Because people tend to only think about it from the tangible commercialization. Did you come up with a mouse type of a thing, versus, what years ago I did research around what they used to refer to as the alpha index, right? How many patents refer to your patent as prior art, right? And so therefore, it measures the level of influence of your research, not just the commercialization of your research. And
yeah, that's how you get tenure. How many people cited your article in important AAA journals? And there's a number of ways to do it. There's a problem though, Phil.
Yep.
The problem is innovation is what we call a convex form of value. It pays in the future,
Right.
right? It
And
doesn't pay today. There's
it,
no data on the future. So you have to do proxies and stress tests and a lot of weird stuff we don't want to get into on this broadcast. But almost all measures I've ever seen, and I started doing these measurements in 1990. How many times has an innovation index ever beaten the Russell 2500, which is the growth index? In that entire period of time, how many times has anyone ever beaten it?
we're
And the
gonna
answer is
don't answer that. We're gonna answer that in the next segment. So
okay.
don't go anywhere. We're gonna take a quick commercial break. We got to let the advertisers earn their buck here. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick, short commercial break. Welcome back to Killer Innovations as we continue our conversations with Jeff Degraff. Now, Jeff, you were just about to answer when I cut you off, right? You were asking about these innovation indexes versus the Russell. So what's the answer? How many times have the indexes beat it?
Out of all of them, 6 times in that entire decades, which is basically rounding error. Statistically, you're just as likely to hit it as not hit it with that, which tells you something important, which is there are the 2 types of value that innovation creates. Concave value, which means things that are presently manifesting, which are incremental by nature.
Right.
And convex value, which are longer term issues. And oh, by the way, in the index that we developed a whole bunch of proxies on this model that we developed called the innovation genome. I see it everywhere. It was originally called the competing values framework, right? So most people learn at business school. But the issue is you have to measure the 2 types of innovation completely different. And organizations get this wrong. And that's why their payout and how much capitalized value is left on the table is always a huge issue for investors.
Well, and it's interesting because you look at, what I would refer to as the love affair with innovation, right? Even consumers, right? I remember, with consumers or businesses in that matter, you build an expectation that there's always something new, something better, some breakthrough, some magic solution to the problem. And you got to be, take Apple as an example, right? I remember, was it 3 or 4 years ago when Apple did not have the typical September release of their new iPhone? They delayed it. They didn't make any announcement. They didn't announce, they never announced the date they were going to release it. Consumers were expecting it. It didn't happen. And the share price takes a hit. So you almost build up, there's this expectation of this love affair with innovation without people really understanding what does that really mean.
Well, I'll give you a great example today. Innovation is often event driven. By
Right.
any objective standard, the United States has completely flubbed it on this virus, right? We are on any objective measurable status, we're the same as Mexico, Brazil, and India right now. Terrible. So that's the story most people are telling. But what's happened is these federations of loose confederations of innovators, Oxford and AstraZeneca, Harvard and Moderna, Michigan Pfizer, Imperial and J&J, with dozens of startups, fintech, the VC community, and all of the sudden, what you're seeing is the development of a vaccine should take 5 to 8.5 years. Now, version 1 is going to be done in 1 year, but let's say a true version is going to be in 2 years. What people miss all the time is that innovation, when it's discontinuous, it not only cannot be assimilated into the old model, stage gating, portfolio, but it actually assumes the old model, right? And this is what we're seeing right now. Education will not be the same after this. Health,
Right.
the development of drug discovery. So to me, what's interesting is the one thing that you can't do with measures is you can't take into account all the variability of events.
Right. And it is because you tend to the consumer only sees the end result. They only
That's
see
right.
the thing, not all of the experimentations, all of the federation connections, or the influence that may have, because look, some of the vaccine work, for instance, in COVID, is built off of research. It's not research that's done in the last 30 days. It's based on the
That's right.
science that universities and companies have invested in for decades to lay the foundation.
And startups that these big pharmas have had equity positions in for 15 years didn't know what they could do with them. Absolutely true. And in fact, our love of gadgets is distracting. Really big innovations typically happen in things like material science and supply chain and manufacturability. And we're going to see that. So people are going to go, oh, we've got a solution in the vaccine. Then you got to figure out how are we going to make 7 billion doses of this stuff and deliver it everywhere. That's a whole different problem. That's way more than design thinking. You got to start looking way down manufacturability here. And that's what big innovation's about. That's what my career's been about. A lot of moving parts.
Right. Yeah. And this gets into an interesting question, though, about the encouragement of innovation. How do you create the environment to have those groups and those influences and all those? I mean, you talked about the fact that, what you did at Michigan, but you could also point to things in the past, like the space program and putting the man on the moon and all of the residual things that have come off of that because of that concentration of focus, kind of creates, I don't know, the heat and energy necessary, I guess, to kind of push it out.
Fact, I write a lot about what's called the creative power of constructive conflict. So when you start looking into this whole idea, and one of the things happened early in my career, I started noticing that about 20 to 30 places in the United States produced almost all the intellectual property. You were in Palo Alto before. I'm in Ann Arbor. Somebody's in Raleigh, Durham. And what you notice about those places isn't just that they have universities. That's almost a side benefit. What you notice is you drive 30 miles in any direction out of those places and people start looking the same. So there's a real correlation to diversity. And when we start looking at patents awarded, particularly in Silicon Valley, from 2000 to 2010, over half to people who were born in this country or people who are first generation. And that's been a history of our country. We're a heterogeneous country. And that difference creates not alignment, it creates constructive conflict, positive tension, hybrids, new stuff.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, and from the standpoint of, I don't know, we're probably close to the same age, given our history and when we were like in the Valley at the same time and that. But do you buy into this concept that the innovations for the young?
I don't, but I do have one real challenge for the young. I'm very concerned about a sense of destiny. I'm an old guy. I grew up, I'm born the year after Sputnik goes to space. We grew up with science. We grew up, we're going to the moon. We're going to lick the commies. We're going to build the net. We did all that.
Right.
A huge ambition. My concern about the younger people is not their talent. It's that they're so micro-segmented. Look at presidential races. Oh, I want, this, I want this, I want this other thing. There's no common thing to unify them, right? Here's one for your listeners. Fix the environment. We ruined it. We're sorry. We didn't mean to. You're not going to fix it by living in a small house. You're going to fix it by getting that car to get 300 miles to a gallon of water. And that's doable. But you got to have the ambition and a sense of destiny to do it. So that's what I want to encourage.
One way to think about this is go back to the space program. And I always use President Kennedy's, what I refer to as BHAG. That really was the unifying, right? Before the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon and we're going to bring them home safely. And it was a rallying cry, right? Well, today's rallying cry is what? Vaccine for COVID, right? It's probably the closest thing. But we don't have those kind of national or global dreams, other than, global warming. Well, you got to, a good BHAG is be clear on the objective, clear definition of success, and give me a time frame.
And the only thing better than a hero is a dead hero. The Greeks have a word for it, kleos. How can you not go to the moon after Kennedy was assassinated? Right. So we're on the same page about this. Your goal can't be we're going to stay the most powerful and richest country in the history of the world. Your goal has to be, where are we going? We're
going to take another quick commercial break, and when we come back, Jeff and I are going to continue the conversation. We have no idea where this is going to go, so don't go anywhere. Be right back after this break. Welcome back to Killer Innovations as we continue the conversation. As I said at the break, Jeff and I have no idea where this conversation is going to go. We end up, given our backgrounds in history, have a lot in common. Now, Jeff, you've got a book coming out. It's going to get published here. Or is it out yet, or is it coming soon?
It's coming soon. The only people who've had it, I had some early copies sent to Pentagon for some people I'm working with.
Okay. So the book is called The Creative Mindset, right? Okay.
Creative mindset. Yep.
So the question I've got for you is look, I've written a book. You've got, I don't know how many books you've got, 8, 9, 10, right? Jeffrey Moore's out there that we both know. Jeffrey, everybody's writing these books. Why this book?
Well,
why would you do that?
I'm from a blue collar neighborhood. I didn't come up the normal way. I got to college, by working, doing a lot of work. And one of the things that really struck me was I grew up in an age where innovation was considered sort of your cultural duty. And I'm going to call it the democratization of innovation. Everybody can do it. And one of the things I see out there is a lot of people who feel powerless. I see lots of books on creativity that are kind of new agey, if you will. I don't know how else to put them. And I see a lot of books out there that are kind of really technical, but they don't really show you, how to build the garage or how to cook the meal. So what I did, remember, I've been in over half the Fortune 500, right, over the years, 2 million miles on Delta alone. I'm an old guy. I've seen a lot of combat, but I'm also an academic. I'm a pragmatic, right? The guys who try stuff. So what I did in this book was I took what I thought was the real research on creativity, right? Going back to Arnheim all the way to now. And I tried to make it palatable. I tried to make it kind of in layman's terms, like I would have wanted to hear about it when I was young. So I say weird things like, look for signs and incongruities, and rather than talking about cognitive mobility, which I think would make people's eyes would glaze over. But the notion is, what I'm trying to tell people is the first thing that you have to do to be creative is pay attention to things that don't necessarily fit. You have to be incredibly mindful. I call this creativizing, taking something ordinary and turning it into something extraordinary. And we all know people like that, don't we, Phil?
Yep.
Maybe your dad was like this, didn't have money, figured to work around. Your mom did, right? We all, we always have that uncle who's in the garage. The notion is, I'm trying to reinstill that. I'm trying to say there's something very fundamentally, about democracy, about building. But the first thing is you got to think the right way about this, which I think people don't often. They think that it's going to flip a switch and it's going to work. Remember, all learning, Phil, is developmental. If you don't believe that, tell your listeners, take out a piece of paper and draw a picture of your dog. And everybody on this chat can tell you at what age you stopped learning to draw. Play an instrument, speak a foreign language. Doesn't matter whether you're 8 or 80. This is a skill. And you developed the skill. How many projects have you worked on in your career, Phil?
Oh, thousands.
Zillions. And how many screw-ups did you have in your career?
Zillions minus 3 or 4.
Yeah, me too. That's the same thing. If you hit 300 in this game, you're going to the hall.
Yeah, you're golden.
Player.
You're golden.
But I want people to get that. I want people to get out and try stuff. So I give them, here's what your mindset should be. So it's sort of like, preparing yourself for a run, or preparing yourself for a good meal. And then I give them what I call the 6 skills. So what I did was, there are all these books on all these different methods. Well, these different methods happen in different parts of your brain. They're used for different reasons. You don't use a screwdriver for a hammer. They're all good methods, but they're not interchangeable. So what I did was I created this mnemonic device, CREATE, CREAT, and it represents these 6 skills. So clarify and replicate and elaborate and associate and translate and evaluate. And I also try and point out lots of examples. So in this book also, there's a video series and a whole bunch of stuff that's are goodies that come free. But what I'm trying to do is give the tools that you would use if you were back at HP, right, in a simplified form to somebody who's trying to build a business, do something with a church group. Is it a big organization and is trying to get 30,000 people to start doing something better and new?
Well, it's interesting because, as you were describing that, I mean, I don't know, but if you've run into this, right? I'll go out, I'll get invited out to do a keynote. You're standing on stage, right? And I did this for Vail Resorts a number of years ago. 500 top executives at Vail, right? So this is people running all the Vail Resorts. Vail is an army culture. The original 5 guys that started Vail all came were part of the Army together. So they're very standard operating procedure oriented, right? So you stand in front of 500 executives and you kind of just do a raise of hands of how many people in the audience think of themselves as creative. And I am shocked by how few people think of themselves as creative. It's somebody else's job, no, it requires a special gift or bounty of DNA to do. And I'm like, no, everybody's
You're exactly
creative.
right. No, it doesn't. And in fact, your brain has two primary functions. It assimilates information and accommodates information, right? We can make it more complicated than that, but that's basically what it does. So the very aspect of thinking has this creative element to it. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to become aware of it, and in some cases disrupt it slightly, right? There's a term for this called defamiliarization, and it's a big term. I don't want that to be the thing that we remember. What I want people to remember is that we have a natural strength like a superhero. Every one of you do, but it's not the same strength. So your strength might be elaborating, and my strength might be associating. The object is to build the strength you've got, first to recognize it. That's what the assessment does. It recognize it, build on it, and then find other people who have other superhero strengths.
Right.
Because you're not going to be good at all of it. Your brain doesn't work that way.
Well, this gets back to my, the point, about team building, and how do you put the right people on the team? It isn't always make sure they're not all like you, right? Which means you got to tolerate people that you might find annoying as part of that effort. But as broad of diversity, and I'm not talking about the HR definition of diversity. I'm also thinking about diversity of thinking styles.
Yep.
There's been a bunch of articles and that written about, who are the 10 types of people that you should have. Kelly did one from IDEO where he listed the 10 people that you should, have on a team, and everybody's kind of trying to look at it. So are you saying then that the assessment and the skills can help you then identify those holes so that you can...
Yeah, in fact, the last book goes right into this, and it's widely used. So if you're familiar with competing values or the innovation code, that's what it does. That's what a lot of the military uses, right? So we developed that a long time ago with Bob Quinn and Kim Cameron. What I'm saying in this one is the assessment here is more like, when are you creative?
Oh, okay.
How are you creative? Are you creative in the morning? Are you creative when music's on? Are you creative when you call your best friend who's in Delhi and 2 a.m. and all of a sudden you're doing stuff? I'm saying it's not creativity on demand. And in fact, there's a lot written about this. I'm sorry to put it this way. Most of that is pablum. Most of the research says we have flow states when we're really creative.
Yep.
So I'll give you an example what a hypocrite I am. I write all the time. I've written over 500 articles. I'm always on the plane. And I always say I'm going to write on the plane. I can never write on the plane, right? So even though I want to, I can't. So then I have to pay attention to, when do I really write? So I get up early the next morning, just like when I'm at home in the hotel room, and then I can write. And your listeners have the same experience. But do you organize your day around that? Do you organize your team around when people are creative?
Right. Yeah, flow is turning to be a kind of a hot topic. There's been a couple of recent books written about it, but they all seem to be fairly esoteric as to finding out when you are in flow and to become self-aware.
Simple thing I could tell everybody: when you feel like it's effortless and timeless. I used to be a studio guitar player in Chicago, and we get paid under the table in the old days, because if there was a union wage, didn't want to pay you, figure out the rest of the records. So we come in around midnight, and some days it just seemed like every minute was an hour, and it was music I didn't like, and then there'd be days where you'd be at somebody's hot record, it'd be music you loved, and the next thing you knew it was 7:30 in the morning. You go out and eat some breakfast. So the notion is flow states are when you're in that state where time is effortless and you feel like it's flown by.
Yeah, it's I think we can all point back to when we were in flow state, right? And it is interesting about being self-aware and knowing what you can do to actually help yourself and optimizing your day and organizing yourself around those optimal times to get into flow state. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, I'm going to put Jeff on the hot seat and ask him for that advice. What advice could the listeners walk away with that they should think about doing that would have the biggest impact on them? So when we come back from this commercial break, Jeff will be in the hot seat to answer that question. Well, welcome back to Innovations as we wrap up the conversation today with Jeff Degraff. Now, Jeff, before we get started, your people refer to you as the Dean of Innovation. Give me the 1 minute version history of how you got tagged as the Dean of Innovation.
Well, when I went to work for Tom Monahan at Dominoes, every time they had a hard problem, it sort of got thrown over to me. And people forget, like, AppleNet becomes iTunes, and we built the first 007 system there, and the mobile satellite system we built to cover the Detroit Tigers, which we owned, became part of ESPN. And so there was a lot of stuff that happened. This little pizza company that was solving a problem for a guy who owned it, a former Marine, I might say. And when I got to the University of Michigan, I got very lucky. I had a number of students who went on to be some pretty famous innovators, and it kind of just stuck.
So, this is the wrap up segment for the show. I always put the guests into the hot seat, looking for what's that one or a couple pieces of advice that the listeners can walk away with today and apply and see impact from it.
Yeah, I'd say a few things. One, innovation doesn't happen from the inside out, it happens from the outside in. Think of a bell curve. At the edges of the bell curve, it's not the 80-20 rule, it's the 20-80 rule. It's easier to change 20% of a company 80% than it is to change 80% of a company 20%. Start with the problem,
Yeah.
right? I've made a career out of it. Nobody calls when things are good. They call when things are not good, right? So either
Right.
side, but you want to have a low hurdle rate. Two, you know, acknowledge your blind spots and, diversify your gene pool. All the people in my labs are different than I am. I don't need another me. It's like basketball. There's Michael Jordan. You need Scottie Pippen and Stockton and the rest of the clowns, right? Grant, everybody else. So be honest with yourself. Stop, resign as master of the universe, right? You're sorry, you're not that good. Nobody is. You got one super skill, get some other people. One of the things I also believe in very strongly is give as much away as you can, right? If you can give it away, give it away. Because what you're really trying to do is build your network. You're trying to create a line
Mhm.
of sight to people who need your help, not
Yeah.
necessarily, there's people who are going to buy, don't get me wrong, but then there's a lot of other people who need your help who can't buy, right? There's no reason you shouldn't be reaching out and helping these folks. I do a lot of those days, and it's not to get a return, but you'd be stunned when you've got a very big innovation ecosystem, how many people call you up and say, "Hey, I got a problem. I know you helped me with this. I've seen your quality. Let's try something together." So I think it's really more about how do you build a diverse group around you? How do you find a problem that needs to be solved? And how do you just become a better human being?
Well, that last point is an interesting one, right? Because I can't tell you how many times I get called, by someone that's got an idea and they just want to run it past me. But then the first thing out of their mouth is here, let me send you an NDA, and now I got to get lawyer. I'm like, I don't think so. I'm not going to rip you off, right? I don't need one more thing on my offer to try to deliver. I've gone through that in my career. I'm more than willing to help you out, but as soon as you throw the roadblock in, because you think it's so unique and so different that nobody else has ever thought of it, and the odds of that happening in today's world is like near zero, right? Somebody else is
Yeah,
working on something very similar.
I agree with that. I want to have a caveat though. I'm a big believer in saying yes as often as I can. I'm with you. When somebody tries to turn it into a commercial thing or tries to get me into endorse something, that's different. Then I'm
Right.
then I'm not in. But the notion is if somebody calls me and says, "Hey, I'm trying to do something for water scarcity in sub-Saharan Africa,"
Yeah.
I'm not going to go all in. I'm very busy, but I'm going to say, I got a half hour. Let's think this through together.
Right.
And that way I can be more like a golf caddy. I'm not swinging the club, but that's an important piece you're getting at. One of the things I look for is who exhibits self authorizing behavior. Who's motivated and owns this project? And when people bring stuff by me and they all want to talk about VC money and all this, I'm like, no, you're not owning this.
Right.
I'm interested if you're going to own it in helping you, but if you're not, I'm not interested at all.
Right.
Right. And then and the people I'm going to help are like you, people I know who I've worked with before. So somebody calls me up on the phone out of nowhere and says, "Hey, here I am, help me." It's like, well, you need to do some helping of yourself first.
Right. Well, and there's also this attitude that the only way I can be successful is I need to go raise a whole boatload of cash. I just had a conversation with an entrepreneur, on
Please
this
don't.
where before they would even take the first step, it was like they needed $1.5 million. I'm like, not happening.
No, I'm like you. I've been very careful in my career never to take VC money. I've been on a lot of VC panels. I got nothing against VCs. I just am very big that you proof the concept. Show me,
Yep.
show me your quality
Yep.
before you go start looking for money.
Proof-
Show me, and it's been amazing. I've seen people build amazing things out of PVC.
Yep.
I've seen amazing, stuff done in a 2-person wet lab that basically becomes a buffering agent for, drugs that people can't take right. So to me, no, work it out first off Broadway. And then when you come to Broadway, we'll talk about the money.
Yeah, great point. Hey, Jeff, if people want to keep track of what you're up to, where's the best place they can follow you?
They could do 2 things, jeffdegraff.com, right? And that takes you to all my stuff in the Innovatrium, all the free stuff, the assessments, the whole 9 yards, all the videos. And I'm one of the original LinkedIn influencers, one of the original 25. Jeff Degraff, Dean of Innovation. You want to see what I'm up to? I write a little piece every Monday, a little sort of provocative piece, and tie a bunch of stuff in, bunch of videos on there as well. And obviously the new book, The Creative Mindset, Mastering the 6 Skills That Empower Innovation. Obviously through that, you'll have access to a whole bunch of stuff as well.
Great. Hey, Jeff, and by the way, we'll have all that information on the show notes. So if you're driving in your car, you don't have to try to scratch all this out on a piece of paper.
Please.
So don't do that. Just hop over to Kill Innovations. We'll have all the links there to find Jeff. Jeff, thanks a lot. Really appreciate you taking the time joining us here on Kill Innovations today.
Phil, I had a great time. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So as we wrap up today's show, thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here at Kill Innovations. If you've been a longtime listener, you know the reason why we do this show. It's paying back to my early mentor, Bob Davis, who said I couldn't pay him back. I had to pay it forward, and this is our way of paying it forward. So what I would ask is for you to help me pay it forward by telling others about the show. Give us a ratings over on iTunes and Google and Spotify and iHeart, wherever you find us. And with that, we'll talk to you next week here at Innovations. Bye-bye.